My mother literally banned me from my sister's six-figure dream wedding because she said my face would ruin the aesthetic. 2 months later, my own wedding video just hit 2.5 million views, and now my family is begging for a seat at my table. If you've ever been the sibling that's treated like a background character, stay tuned. This revenge is served with a side of pure irony. If you've ever felt like the black sheep of your family, stick around, because this ending is the ultimate "I told you so." My name is Jade Emerson. I'm 31 years old, and a few weeks ago, I became a name that millions of people recognize. But this story doesn't start with fame. It starts with a phone call from my mother, Valerie. You know that specific, shaky tone people use when they're about to do something cruel but want to sound like they're doing you a favor? That was her. "Jade, honey," she said, her voice tight and over-rehearsed. "It's probably better if you just skip the ceremony. You'd throw off the balance of the bridal party." She was talking about my younger sister, Sierra's, wedding. Sierra was marrying a guy named Preston Vanderbilt. Yeah, one of those Vanderbilts. The wedding was being held at the Obsidian Ridge, a venue so expensive they charge you just for breathing the air. And my mother, Valerie Emerson, had decided that I was the one unpolished detail that didn't belong in Sierra's perfect world. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe. And if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing where these stories travel. Let me take you back to a humid Tuesday in May. The evening my phone rang and my mother's voice came through like a weather forecast nobody asked for. I was in my apartment, a whisk in one hand and a phone tucked between my ear and shoulder. I was prepping a lemon tart. Baking is the only thing that keeps my anxiety from redlining. When the phone rang, I knew it was trouble. My mom only calls at dinner time when she has bad news to deliver. "Jade, we need to talk about the ridge," she started, skipping any kind of greeting. "The photography team is very specific about the look of this event. It's a high-fashion, editorial vibe. You understand, right?" I didn't say anything. I've learned that if you give my mother a long enough silence, she'll eventually stop using corporate speak and show you her true colors. "Besides," she added, "Marcus wouldn't exactly blend in, would he? You know how he is with fancy crowds." Marcus, my fiancé, the man who runs a nonprofit urban garden and spends his days covered in rich soil and sunshine. The kind of guy who once spent his entire rent check to help a local family after a house fire. A man with dirt under his nails and a heart of absolute gold. "Mom," I said, putting the whisk down on the flour-dusted counter, "are you actually uninviting me from my only sister's wedding?" "I'm saying it's a strategic choice for the family image," she replied. "No apology. No, I love you. Just a cold business decision." I stood there, staring at the tart shell, trying to remember the last time I wasn't treated like a draft version of my sister. I couldn't find one. Not one single time. This was the pattern, and I'd been living inside it so long I'd mistaken it for wallpaper. Sierra's Sweet 16, a professional DJ and a custom gown. My 16th, a grocery store cake and a card she'd clearly signed in the car on the way home. Sierra's engagement announcement is framed on the mantel. Mine met with a 4-second silence and then, "Well, I hope you thought this through." Holiday photos on the wall where I'd been cropped out so neatly you'd think the family only had one daughter. That night, I threw the lemon tart in the trash. Marcus found me sitting on the balcony in the dark at 3:00 a.m. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just draped his jacket over my shoulders and handed me a glass of water, smelling like rain and fresh rosemary. The thing about being the plain sibling is that you don't always notice it happening. It creeps in sideways like humidity. You wake up one day and everything is damp and you can't remember when it started. Sierra's graduation, Mom threw a gala and hired a professional photography team. There are 47 photos from that day, I counted once. Sierra in her cap, Sierra with her friends, Sierra and Mom, cheek to cheek, looking like a jewelry commercial. My graduation, a congrats text sent 2 days late because they were at Sierra's cheer competition. No apology, no follow-up, just a question mark that somehow felt like a period. Sierra's engagement party. My mother flew to NYC, booked a penthouse, and coordinated a brunch for 50 guests. When I called her to say Marcus had proposed, the line went quiet for 4 seconds. I counted those, too. "Well," she said, "I hope you thought this through." The smell of high-end perfume was what I remembered most. Every special occasion, my mother stood in the bathroom misting Sierra's hair until she looked like a magazine cover. I'd sit on the edge of the bathtub watching. She never turned the bottle toward me, not once. It took me a long time to understand that I wasn't the problem. My face was. I looked like my father, the man who walked out when I was 10. The man my mother never forgave. The man whose stubborn jaw and dark, observant eyes lived on in my mirror every morning. Sierra is my mother's carbon copy, polished, blonde, and easy to market. Every time my mother looks at me, she sees the man who broke her heart. One night, I went digging through the storage unit and found a box tucked behind the old Christmas lights. Inside was every childhood photo of me that used to hang on the wall. All of them removed from their frames, stacked face down, edges soft with moisture. Sierra's photos were still in the living room, dust-free and backlit. I put the box back. Some evidence doesn't need a courtroom. It just needs you to finally stop pretending you didn't see it. Marcus's garden center sat at the end of a dirt road that hugged the edge of town, past a row of old oaks and a fence that had seen better days. The main building was an old greenhouse with glass panes that caught the light in a way that made you feel like you were standing inside a diamond. Inside, it smelled like damp earth and blooming jasmine. When I drove out there after the phone call, Marcus was transplanting heirloom tomatoes. The rhythm of his hands was the only sound between us for a while. I sat on an old cedar bench and told him what my mother said. He didn't stop working. "Your mom's not the villain of this story, Jade," he said finally. "She's just a woman who's obsessed with a script." I never thought of it that way. Afraid of what? Of me. Of the fact that you built a life that she didn't design. We talked about our wedding. We'd been planning something low-key, right here in the garden. No flash, just flowers and friends. Marcus was going to build the altar himself. We didn't have a coordinator or a luxury budget. We had a sunset and 100 people who actually loved us. "She said you wouldn't fit in at the ridge," I told him. He wiped a smudge of dirt off his forehead with his sleeve. The greenhouse doors were open, and the late sun was turning everything amber. "Jade, I wasn't invited to the Christmas dinner last year either," he said, like he was just stating a fact. No bitterness, no performance. I watched him go back to his plants. Underneath all the dirt, the roots were strong. They just needed someone patient enough to let them grow. Sierra called 2 days later. I knew it was coming, the way you know a storm is coming when the birds go quiet. "Jade, oh my God, hi," she chirped. I could hear her typing in the background. "I heard Mom had the talk with you, just so you know it wasn't my idea." "Wasn't it?" I asked. "Totally, I told her you should be there, but you know how she gets about the vision." And honestly, she paused, a fake sympathetic sigh, "Preston's family is very stiff, and Marcus, no offense, but he'd probably want to talk about compost at the rehearsal dinner. Marcus has a master's degree and can outtalk anyone in a room, but Sierra didn't know that. She never bothered to learn. "Let's do a private brunch after we get back from Cabo," Sierra suggested. "I'll pay, just us." The Sierra Special. A consolation prize disguised as generosity. A brunch I didn't ask for to replace an event I was excluded from. She'd been doing it since we were kids. Break my doll, then offer me a sticker. Always the one she didn't want. "I appreciate the call, Sierra," I said. "Of course, I just didn't want you to think I don't." A beat then. "Okay, love you." I hung up, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the familiar sting of rejection. I felt something cold and incredibly clear. I'd spent 31 years translating my family's behavior into something I could live with. "Mom doesn't mean it that way. Sierra is just stressed." I was fluent in that language, but sitting there in my kitchen, I realized I was done translating. The words meant exactly what they said. You'd throw off the balance. He wouldn't blend in. My treat. The message was finally loud and clear, and I was done listening. Most people spend months stressing over a seating chart to avoid family drama. I spent mine realizing I didn't have a family to seat. I had a community to honor. While my mother was busy counting the thread count of napkins at a resort that didn't want us, I was busy counting the people who actually showed up when my life was falling apart. This is the moment I stopped being a daughter and started being a woman who knew exactly who her people were. Some conversations end with a goodbye. This one ended with a period I'd been too polite to place for 3 decades. The following Saturday, I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a massive roll of brown craft paper. Through the window, I could hear the muffled bass of the radio in Marcus's shop, classic rock, just loud enough to feel like a heartbeat. I uncapped a navy pen and started writing names. It wasn't a guest list, it was a gratitude list. Margaret Tillman, the neighbor who'd brought over Tupperware of homemade soup every time she heard me coughing for the last 7 years. Not because I asked, but because she noticed. Dave and Alina Parker, my old coworkers who showed up at midnight with a moving truck and a case of water when my apartment flooded. Alina brought packing tape and a positive attitude, while Dave carried my heavy oak dresser down 4 flights of stairs without a single complaint. Coach Miller, my high school track coach, who drove 3 hours through a thunderstorm just to watch me receive a community service award that not a single member of my family attended. He sat in the back row and cheered like I'd just broken a world record. Mrs. Gable, my junior year art teacher, wrote, "Your vision is your power" on my final project. I'd found her on social media a decade ago, and we've traded handwritten birthday cards ever since. Marcus added his name to the list. There was Frank, the retired gardener who taught him how to graft apple trees when he was 19. There was the Nguyen family, whose community garden Marcus had rebuilt for free after a freak hailstorm destroyed their livelihood. There was Janet, his very first client, who still stopped by every spring with jars of homemade peach preserves. By noon, we had 120 names. Every single person on that list could tell you a story about why they were on that paper. There were no obligation invites, no business contacts to impress, no people we'd met once at a cocktail party. These were the hands that held ours when things got heavy. Marcus looked at the list and whispered, 120 people. Every one of them is a ride or die. I picked up the pen one last time. At the very bottom of the craft paper, I wrote one more name, my mother. I circled it in blue ink. Marcus saw it. He didn't say a word. He just refilled my coffee and headed back to the garden. Some invitations are offered with both hands open, knowing full well they might be handed back. Sierra's wedding was on a Saturday in late June. I knew because Instagram wouldn't let me forget, and my mother had been posting a countdown that felt more like a threat. I spent that morning in my garden, turning the soil in the raised beds Marcus had built from old barn wood. The dirt was cool and damp, and there was something incredibly grounding about pushing my hands into the earth while my sister said, "I do" to a man I'd spoken to for maybe 10 minutes total. By that afternoon, the Grand Ivory photos started flooding my feed. The Obsidian Ridge was draped in thousands of dollars of white silk. There were 300 guests in gilded chairs, a 5-tier cake, a live string quartet, and Sierra in a gown that probably cost more than my college degree. My mother was beaming in every shot, a smile I knew was rehearsed because I'd watched her practice it in the hallway mirror since she was a teenager. I scrolled through the photos like I was looking at a house I used to live in, curious, but not homesick. I recognized maybe 30 people in the entire crowd. The rest were strangers, Preston's business partners, my mother's status friends, people whose names appeared on fancy place cards but wouldn't appear in anyone's call logs at 2:00 a.m. when life got real. That evening, my Aunt Sarah called. She was my mother's younger sister and the only person in that bloodline who treated me like I existed on purpose. "I wish you were here, Jade," she whispered. Her voice was low, like she was hiding in a coat closet. "Your mother is putting on an absolute performance." I could hear the reception in the background, the clinking of crystal, the thumping bass of a DJ playing something expensive. "Are you doing okay?" she asked. "I'm great, Aunt Sarah, truly." "Good, because I'm eating a crab cake that costs $20 a bite and it tastes like cardboard. This party has no soul." I thanked her and meant it. Then I put the phone down and went back to the garden. That night, Sierra posted a video of her first dance. 800 likes, dozens of comments from strangers, and one from Mom, my perfect girl. I closed the app. In 6 weeks, it would be my turn, and I wasn't going to perform for anyone. I made my mother's invitation by hand. I used the same craft paper from the guest list. I wrote her name in navy ink, tucked a sprig of dried rosemary inside, and sealed it with wax from a candle Margaret had given me. It was an invitation that asked for nothing but her presence. Marcus watched me seal the envelope. "Are you sure about this?" "She's my mother," I said. "I know, that's why I'm asking." I mailed it on Monday. By Thursday, I'd already stopped expecting a yes. Not because I was cynical, but because I'd been managing my mother's silences for so long I'd learned how to breathe through them. She called on Friday while I was doing the dishes. "A garden center?" she asked, her voice flat and horrified, like I'd invited her to a crime scene. "You want me to sit on a folding chair and watch you marry a guy who grows kale for a living?" "He's a botanist and a nonprofit director, Mom. And yes, there's a seat with your name on it." "Jade, be realistic. This isn't a wedding, this is a hobby." "It's ours," I said. She paused, recalibrating the way she always did when I didn't follow the script. "I'll think about it," she said. In my mother's world, I'll think about it as just a polite way of saying no. The kind of no she could later use to claim she'd been thoughtful. 3 days later, the invitation came back. Unopened. On the front, in her firm, practiced handwriting, "Return to sender." No note, no explanation. Just those 3 words in the same blue ink I'd used for her name, as if she'd chosen it specifically to mock me. I stood at the mailbox for a long time. The rosemary sprig had slipped through a tear in the envelope, dried and fragile. I took it inside and pressed it between the pages of my grandmother's old recipe book, the one Valerie had tried to throw out after the funeral, the one I'd rescued from the curb. The binding was cracked, and it smelled like cinnamon and old paper. It held recipes for every kind of love my grandmother believed in. Some things you keep because they are yours. Other things you keep because someone needs to remember they existed. The transformation started on a Saturday in July, 5 weeks before our date. Marcus sent a text to his entire network, not a mass email, just personal messages that said, "We're getting the garden ready. Bring whatever you've got." They showed up with everything. Dave Parker arrived first with a truck full of reclaimed wood. He spent the entire afternoon building a dance floor on the stone patio where Marcus usually kept the heavy planters. By sunset, it was smooth, level, and smelled like fresh-cut pine. Margaret came over with her vintage lace curtains from the 70s, the ones she'd used at her own wedding, kept in tissue paper for decades. She draped them across the greenhouse doors so they'd catch the summer breeze. Have you ever noticed that the people who scream the loudest about class and status are usually the ones with the most to hide? While my mother was busy trying to assassinate my character with every family member who would listen, we were building something she could never understand, a sanctuary. She thought she was protecting the family reputation. In reality, she was the only one tearing it down. The vintage lace was delicate and slightly ivory, turning the afternoon sun into a scene that looked like a Renaissance painting. Elena Parker was up on a ladder she'd borrowed from the elementary school, stringing warm Edison bulbs along the greenhouse rafters. Her 12-year-old daughter, Maya, was busy threading mason jars with lavender, baby's breath, and white daisies from Margaret's backyard. Marcus's friend from the local nursery, a guy named Silas who mostly communicated in nods, welded a custom arch from salvaged iron and set it right at the entrance of the main greenhouse. It was raw, imperfect, and absolutely stunning. By the end of that first weekend, the garden center didn't look like a place of business anymore. It looked like a place that had been waiting for this exact moment. The total cost? $3,800. The food would be a massive potluck. The music was just a speaker playing Marcus's favorite vinyl-recorded playlist. And the cake, a lemon pound cake from a family recipe, would be baked by Marcus's mother, Martha. Margaret stood back, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "It looks like a place where real things happen," she said. She was right, and real things don't need a guest list of 300 strangers to prove they exist. but my mother could never leave well enough alone. 2 weeks after she returned my invitation, my Aunt Sarah called with that doctor delivering bad news voice. "Jade, honey, your mother is on a warpath. She's been calling everyone." "What do you mean, calling everyone?" "The whole family. She told Uncle Mike that you're having some kind of mental breakdown. She's telling people this greenhouse wedding is actually a cry for help." I sat there listening to the hum of my dryer in the background. Domestic peace has a sound, and apparently it's the sound of a spin cycle while your mother dismantles your life one phone call at a time. "She even called Marcus's mother," Sarah added quietly. That stopped my heart. She told Martha that Marcus isn't stable enough to support you, something about his nonprofit failing. Marcus's garden center had never failed. It had gotten tight once, 3 years ago, when a major donor pulled out, but he'd worked 80-hour weeks and rebuilt it from the ground up. The greenhouse was still standing, and so was he. That evening, my Uncle Mike called. He's a straight shooter who fixes HVAC systems for a living. "Your mom called," he said, skipping the small talk. "Says you're not doing well. That true?" "I'm fine, Uncle Mike. I'm getting married in a garden with 120 people who actually care if I breathe." There was a long pause. "Your mother has always been creative with the facts," he said. I heard it then, the sound of a man moving his loyalty from one side of the line to the other. When Marcus came home that night, he was quieter than usual. He hung up his keys and stood at the sink, letting the water run over his hands much longer than necessary. "Your mother called mine," he said finally. "I know. Whatever she said, I'm so sorry." "She's trying to break things before they can start," he murmured. I didn't ask what things. I already knew. My mother wasn't trying to stop a wedding. She was trying to stop me from building a life that proved hers was a lie. Martha Gallagher drove 4 hours from the coast the next morning without a heads-up. She showed up in her dusty SUV with a cooler in the back and a look that said she'd already made up her mind. "I wanted to see this crying for help garden," she said, hugging me at the door. Martha is 63, broad-shouldered, and the kind of woman you trust within 5 minutes. She'd raised 3 boys on a teacher's salary after her husband passed. She had calluses on her hands and opinions she didn't bother sugarcoating. I took her to the center. She stood in the greenhouse doors, looking at the sunset hitting the iron arch and the dance floor Dave had built. She didn't say a word for a long time. Then she walked to the front row, found the chair with Margot's name on it, and nodded. "This is the most honest thing I've seen in years." We sat on the bench with iced tea, and I told her the truth. The returned invite, the smear campaign. "Your mother called me," Martha said. "Told me my son wasn't ready. I told her my son has been building things since he was 12. He built me a greenhouse that survived 3 hurricanes. He'll build Jade a good life." She took a sip of tea. I told her if she had concerns about my son's work, she was welcome to come see it. She hung up. Before Martha left, the house smelled like lemon zest and butter. She'd already started a test batch of the cake, leaving notes in the margins of my grandmother's cookbook. Adjust for humidity. Use cold butter. Beside the ingredient list, she'd drawn a tiny heart. A few days later, a woman named Nina Vance showed up at the garden by accident. She was 27, a reporter for the local paper, working on a series about small businesses that survived the recession. Marcus's center was on her list. She arrived with a camera and a notepad, expecting to talk about supply chains. Instead, she found twinkle lights in the rafters and jars of wildflowers everywhere. "Are you getting married here?" she asked, her eyes wide. "Next month," I said, sorting the seating cards. Nina's eyes went from the iron arch to the dance floor, then to the clothesline I'd strung between 2 trees for guests to hang handwritten notes. "Can I feature the wedding for the piece? This is a much better story than a business profile." I said yes, not for the publicity, but because Nina looked at the greenhouse the same way Margot had, like she was seeing something she'd forgotten was possible. "This is going to be a huge story," she said. I thought she meant the local paper. I didn't know yet that she had much bigger plans, and that was probably for the best. Some things are meant to be seen by more than just 120 people. The cracks in Sierra's perfect wedding arrived via Aunt Sarah. She delivered the tea like a pro. Sierra and Preston had a massive blowout, Sarah said. I was sitting on the greenhouse steps, feet in the grass. At the reception, publicly. What happened? Preston's mother cornered Valerie at the dessert table. She said, and I'm quoting, "I don't know half of these people. Who are they?" It turns out half of Sierra's 300 guests were my mother's additions. Her bridge club, her old college roommates, her hair stylist's family. People Sierra had never met. People who were only there so my mother could have an audience for her production. Sierra lost it. She dragged Mom into the bridal suite and screamed, "You invited your entire social circle. This was supposed to be my day." And my mother, she just said, "I paid for half of this. I can invite whoever I want." I closed my eyes. For a second, I thought I might feel a spark of "I told you so." But all I felt was sad. Sad for Sierra, who'd traded her soul for a spectacle and was shocked when it shattered. Sad for Mom, who couldn't stop performing long enough to realize the audience didn't care. "Your mother and your sister are more alike than they'll ever admit," Sarah said. And in that moment, I realized how lucky I was to be the one who didn't fit in. Part 4, The Empty Chair. Story connection, hook, retention point. Most brides dream of their mother helping them into their dress. Champagne, mirrors, and happy tears. I didn't call my mother. I called my neighbor, Margaret. Because when you've spent your whole life being a second choice, you eventually realize you have the power to choose who stands behind you. I wasn't looking for a perfect wedding anymore. I was looking for an honest one. The story continues. We went to a tiny vintage boutique downtown. It was the kind of place where the air smells like old cedar and vanilla, and the dresses hang on heavy wooden hangers like secrets waiting to be told. Margaret wore her reading glasses on a chain and had a lace handkerchief tucked into her sleeve. She'd already decided she was going to cry. I tried on 3 dresses. The first was too much, beading and layers of tulle that felt like wearing someone else's ego. The second was a simple slip that didn't hold any shape. But the third, it was ivory tea-length, with delicate lace at the wrists and a neckline that sat perfectly across my collarbone. It looked like something my grandmother would have worn in an old Polaroid from a time when weddings were small, and the cake was baked by someone who actually loved you. "Oh," Margaret whispered, her hand pressed flat against her chest. She stood up and walked over, her hands shaking slightly as she started on the back. It had dozens of tiny pearl buttons. She fastened them one by one, with the kind of patience you only use when you know a moment actually matters. "I buttoned my own daughter's gown 30 years ago," she said softly. "I never thought I'd get to do this again." Margaret's daughter lived halfway across the world. They hadn't spoken in years for reasons Margaret kept folded away as carefully as her wedding linens. I didn't ask. Some silences aren't mine to break. I looked at myself in that 100-year-old mirror with a chip in the corner. No professional glam squad, no mother whispering about my complexion. Just me, Margaret, and a dress that fit like it had been waiting in that shop for exactly this moment. The tears hit me then, not for the wedding but for my grandmother. She's been gone 8 years, but I knew she would have sat in that shop chair and wept without apology. She would have said, "That's my girl," and she would have meant it. My mother showed up on my porch 3 weeks before the big day. No text, no warning. She was carrying a leather-bound photo album with gold trim, the kind where the container is way more expensive than the memories inside. "I've been thinking," she said, stepping into my house without being invited. "Maybe it's not too late to do this the right way." The right way. A real venue, a guest list that matters. She opened the album to a page of Sierra's wedding. It was all high-def, filtered, and glossy. "This is what a wedding is supposed to look like, Jade. I have connections. I can get you the ridge at a massive discount for a Thursday night." I leaned against the counter and just let her talk. It was her classic move, a monologue disguised as a favor. She went on about catering and color palettes, and I realized what she was actually doing. She wasn't offering help. She was offering a takeover. She wanted to turn my life into another franchise of her perfect family brand. "Mom," I said, cutting her off, The wedding is planned, every seat has a name. But none of those people are family, Jade. I looked around my kitchen. At the walls Marcus, and I had painted, at the shelf he'd built for my grandmother's recipes, at the view of Margot's garden through the window. All of them are family, I said, just not yours. Her face didn't flash with anger. It flashed with fear. The kind of fear that hits when you realize you've been locked out of a room you assumed you owned. She left her coffee untouched. That night I opened the album she'd left behind. Page after page of Sierra. Sierra and Preston. Sierra and Mom. But there were gaps. Places where photos had been ripped out. Every single photo of me had been systematically removed, leaving nothing but empty white corners. I closed the book and put it in the garage, right next to the box of everything else she'd tried to erase. 2 weeks before the ceremony, I walked through the greenhouse alone at dusk. The Edison bulbs were humming, casting warm circles on the glass. Maya's mason jars were filled with fresh lavender and daisies. The iron arch was glowing in the twilight. I walked the rows, reading the name cards I'd handwritten in navy ink. Margot Tillman, Martha Gallagher, 2 women who didn't owe me a drop of blood but had mothered me better than the woman who did. Uncle Mike, Coach Miller, and then the empty chair in the front row. The card simply said, Mom. Part of me wanted to shred that card, to reclaim the space for someone who actually wanted to be there, but I knew that's not why it was there. Marcus found me staring at it, sawdust still on his shoulders from his final project. Leave it, he said. Not for her, for you, so you know you never closed the door. The rehearsal dinner was a massive potluck on the greenhouse patio. No microphones, no 5-course menus. Dave Parker stood up first. Jade once spent 3 months helping a stranger save their community garden from being paved over, he said. She doesn't just show up, she stays. That's who she is. She's a builder. Coach Miller raised a plastic cup of lemonade. I coached Jade when she was 15. She wasn't the fastest on the track, but she was the one who stayed late to make sure everyone had a ride home, every single day. Janet, Marcus's first client, stood up with her hands in her pockets. Marcus rebuilt my porch after the storm and refused to take a dime. He said he was just investing in the neighborhood. That's the man your daughter is marrying. She looked at the empty chair, then looked back at us. Marcus's toast was the shortest. He stood by the iron arch, one hand in his pocket. Jade is the first person who looked at my messy greenhouse and didn't see a project, he said. She saw a home. That night my phone buzzed. A text from Sierra. I heard about the greenhouse wedding. So vintage. Good luck. The period at the end of that text said more than the words ever could. The morning of the wedding, I woke up before the sun. The house was dead quiet. Marcus had texted at 5:00 a.m. At the center, just checking the lights. See you soon. He has a habit of needing to touch every surface before a big moment, like a captain checking his ship. Margot arrived at 7:00 a.m. with a bouquet she'd picked at dawn. Lavender, rosemary, and the tiniest white daisies I'd ever seen. The rosemary is for remembrance, she said. Your grandmother is here, Jade. She helped me into the dress, her hands steady as she worked those pearl buttons. I buttoned my own daughter's dress once, she whispered. She looked beautiful, but you look real. I didn't correct her. Real was better. I looked in the mirror, no heavy contouring, just me. The lace at my wrists caught the morning light. I looked like myself, which was the only person I wanted to be that day. My phone sat on the counter, silent. I'd left a space for a call from my mother, a moment where she might tell me I looked beautiful or ask if I was nervous. That moment came and went, and I let it go. Margot handed me the bouquet. Ready. I nodded, and I meant it. I wasn't just ready because the planning was done. I was ready because I was finally finished waiting for people who were never coming. There was no traditional walk down the aisle with a father. No one gave me away because I wasn't property to be traded. I walked in alone through the side greenhouse door, the same way I'd been entering Marcus's life for years. Marcus was standing under the iron arch. He'd put on a clean white button-down and the one pair of dress shoes he owned, polished until they shone. When he saw me, he didn't cry. He just nodded once. It was the look a builder gives a structure when he knows it's finally going to hold. Our vows were short. I'd written mine on a card, but I didn't need it. You never asked me to be a curated version of myself, I told him. You never edited me out. You just handed me a glass of water and sat with me in the dark. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice thick. Jade, you taught me that a garden without someone to share it with is just dirt, and a dream without a partner is just a wish. I heard Margaret crying before I saw her, a quiet, dignified sound from the front row. Martha had her hand on Margaret's arm, and Martha was crying too, which I'd never seen before. Uncle Mike clapped first. He clapped firmly, like he meant it, like the sound itself was a decision. The ceremony lasted exactly 22 minutes. No ice sculptures, no orchestra, no 300 strangers. Just 120 people who actually knew us, and one empty chair in the front row that said more than any speech could. Nina Vance was filming from the side, her camera unobtrusive. I'd almost forgotten she was there. I wouldn't forget for long. The reception spilled onto the patio like something that couldn't be contained. Potluck plates covered every surface. Margaret's cornbread, Alina's pasta salad, and a massive pot of chili from Coach Miller. My ex-wife's recipe, he joked. The only thing I won in the settlement. People danced on Dave's cedar floor. Martha and Margaret sat together, sharing a slice of lemon cake and talking like they'd been best friends for decades. But the clothesline was the thing that got me. I'd put it up as an afterthought, blank cards and wooden clips. Write something or don't. By 9:00 p.m., the line was full. I walked along it, reading under the twinkle lights. Thank you for being the neighbor who helped me with my groceries every week. Marcus, you saved our community garden when the city wouldn't listen. I drove 4 hours because some people are worth the miles. Every card was a receipt for something real. Not a grand gesture, just the small, accumulating evidence of 2 lives lived in genuine connection. One card near the end said, I'm just a +1. I don't even know the bride, but I wish every wedding felt this honest. I stood on the patio at 10:00 p.m. and looked at the moon. Somewhere across town, the Obsidian Ridge was hosting a performance. Here, with lemon cake and handwritten notes and a husband who smelled like rosemary, I had everything I was told I didn't deserve. 3 days after the wedding, my phone rang. It was Nina. So, she said, in that way journalists do when they're about to change the scale of your life. The piece went live this morning. I titled it, The Greenhouse Wedding, A Life Built by Hand. That's nice, I said, putting away dishes. It has a 4-minute video, the vows. The notes, the sunset. Jade, it's already at 50,000 views. I sat down. By noon, it was at 100,000. I watched the numbers climb like a fever. The comments were overwhelming. This is what a real wedding looks like. I've spent $50K on a wedding and felt half as much as this. Who was supposed to sit in that empty chair? The empty chair. Nina's camera had lingered on it for just 3 seconds, long enough for the name card to be readable, long enough for the absence to land. By that evening, 200,000 strangers were sharing clips of our vows. They weren't sharing a wedding. They were sharing a hunger for the real in a world that had been feeding them the curated. I didn't know how to feel. I'd built a boundary, and now the internet was turning it into content. But I knew who would see it next. I knew the algorithm didn't care about my boundaries. And I knew that in a house that smelled like expensive perfume and performance, my mother was about to watch her invisible daughter become visible to millions. By day 4, it hit 2 million. Lifestyle blogs picked it up. A Facebook group with nearly 1 million members shared it with the caption, "This is the standard." The headline that spread fastest wasn't Nina's. It was, "Bride leaves empty chair for mother who refused to attend." It hit a nerve so deep it felt like a collective trauma. My phone became a source of anxiety, interview requests, messages from strangers, wedding magazines. I declined them all. I didn't build that day as a brand. I built it as a survival tactic. But one comment stopped me. A woman named Grace wrote, "My mother did this to me 15 years ago. She told me my husband wasn't enough. Seeing your chair made me feel less crazy. Thank you." Hundreds of replies followed. Women sharing stories of being excluded, told they were ruining the vibe, or ignored. 2 million people had watched my wedding, and the thing they remembered most was a single piece of furniture holding the weight of a question. Why wasn't she there? Sierra texted first. Mom saw the video. No punctuation, no congrats, just a status update. Then Uncle Mike called. His voice was thick. Your mother watched it 4 times, Jade. She called me crying, actually crying. I sat on the bed, listening to the clock tick. She keeps saying, that was my chair. I was supposed to be there, Mike continued. And I told her, Valerie, it was always your chair. You just chose not to sit in it. 20 minutes later, my mother's name appeared on my screen. I answered on the 4th ring. Why did you leave a chair for me? Her voice was cracked, stripped of the polish. She sounded small, like a woman who'd spent so long controlling the stage she forgot how to speak without a script. Because I wanted you there, Mom, I said. I always wanted you there. I just stopped begging. Silence. Then, just before she hung up, I heard a sob, not a theatrical one, a real, ugly, involuntary sound. I put the phone down. Marcus was in the doorway with 2 cups of tea. She cried, I whispered. He just sat next to me. Some things don't need words, they need time. And time was something I was finally willing to give on my own terms. 2 days later, Aunt Sarah told me Mom had read the full article. Nina had listed the connections between the guests. Margaret Tillman, neighbor, brought soup for 7 years. Dave Parker helped Jade move at midnight during a flood. Sarah said Mom read each entry like an indictment. She realized every line was evidence of something she'd missed. Not wealth, not status, just the simple act of showing up. Mom called Sierra afterward. Sarah overheard the start of it. Did you read it? Mom asked. So what? Sierra snapped. She got lucky with a video. Our wedding was 10 times bigger. Bigger, a word that measures square footage but not soul. Sarah said Mom went quiet after that. Not a strategic quiet, but a heavy one. The kind that happens when your whole life's work is measured against a lemon cake and a greenhouse and it comes up short. The letter arrived on Thursday. Plain envelope, shaky handwriting. I watched the video 7 times. It began, "No hello." The 3rd time I noticed the cake and remembered you said Martha baked it. I never met her. The 6th time I read the notes on the line. The 7th time I just looked at the chair. I don't know how to fix this. I'm not sure I can. But I know the chair was real and I know I should have been in it. No, I'm sorry. No, I love you. Just a period. The first honest thing she'd ever given me, and for now it was enough. I read the letter 3 times. Then, I tucked it into my grandmother's old cookbook, right between the recipe for peach cobbler and the dried rosemary from the invitation she'd rejected. I didn't write back, not because I was being petty, but because some doors need to stay open without being pushed. If she ever walks through, it has to be her own feet that carry her. 3 months after the wedding, the video was at 3.2 million views, and I'd stopped checking the numbers. Life had returned to the shape it was always supposed to have. Marcus was back in the greenhouse, talking to his seedlings with that quiet patience he usually saves for things that are just starting to grow. The smell of jasmine and damp earth was back. The rhythm of the seasons was back. My mediation practice had picked up too, not just because of the video, but because the right people saw it. I saw your wedding, one woman told me during a consultation. I figured if you could handle that kind of family dynamic with that much grace, you could handle my legal dispute. I didn't argue with the logic. Margaret and Martha had become actual friends, the kind who call each other on a random Tuesday just to vent. Martha drove down once a month, and they'd sit on Margaret's porch drinking sweet tea and talking about things I wasn't privy to. Your 2 mothers, Marcus called them. I didn't correct him. As for Sierra, silence, complete and total. She hadn't reached out since that one vintage text. She existed in the space between the story and the sequel, present, unresolved, but not yet ready to enter the room. I didn't chase her. Some people need to find the door on their own, and pushing only makes them lock it from the inside. Then, 2 weeks ago, I got a text from Mom. 5 words that must have taken her 61 years to type. Martha's lemon cake recipe. Please. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't an olive branch exactly. It was something smaller and maybe braver, an acknowledgement that Martha's world existed, that my world contained things she didn't have access to. For the first time in my life, she was asking instead of demanding. I forwarded the request to Martha. She sent the recipe back within the hour with a note. Tell her the trick is the temperature of the butter. I was making peach cobbler last Saturday when the cookbook fell open to the wrong page, or maybe the right one. The binding was cracked. It had been since I rescued it from the trash 8 years ago when my mother decided my grandmother's life was clutter. It fell open to the page where I'd pressed the dried rosemary, and right next to it was Valerie's letter, folded like a bookmark. I looked at the handwriting on the page beneath them, my grandmother. In the margin next to the cobbler recipe, she'd written, "For when company comes and you want them to stay." She wrote it practically, as if hospitality were a science. Peel the peaches, butter the pan, make them feel welcome. My grandmother understood something about gathering that my mother never learned. You don't invite people to impress them. You invite them because the table is better with them at it. I looked at that book in my hands. It was a map of the women in my life. Grandma's pencil marks, my dried flowers, Martha's blue pen adjustments, and Mom's shaky letter. 3 of them had shown up. One was still finding her way. I started peeling the peaches. The kitchen filled with the scent of sugar and fruit that was better for having been bruised a little before it was baked. I called Margaret. "Come over tonight. Bring nothing." I set the table for 4. Marcus, Margaret, Martha, and me. But when the cobbler was done, I cut 5 pieces. I set the 5th on a small plate and left it on the counter next to the cookbook. Old habits, I guess, or maybe hope. I went back to the greenhouse one evening in September, long after the internet had moved on to the next viral story. The twinkle lights were still up. Marcus left them because he liked the way they glowed at night, and because taking them down felt like admitting the magic was over. The wildflowers had dried in their jars, brown and curled, but beautiful in the way things are when they've served their purpose. The chairs were all stacked against the glass wall, all except one. It was still there, front row, right side. The name card was weathered now, but the word was still clear. Mom. I sat in it. The wind was moving through the trees, the way it does in September when the heat finally breaks. Through the greenhouse glass, I could see the garden, the old oaks, and the mailbox that still didn't match the house. I could see our kitchen window lit up and Marcus moving behind it, making dinner without rushing, with the confidence of a man who trusts the process. My mother said I'd ruin the aesthetic, but the truth is, I just created my own. I sat in that chair for a while. I didn't pray, and I didn't plan any speeches. I just sat where she was supposed to sit and looked at the world through the frame she would have seen. The lights, the garden, the life her daughter had built without her permission. Then I stood up. I left the chair where it was. I didn't take the name card, and I didn't stack it with the others. I just left it facing the sunset. Some chairs stay empty, not as a punishment, and not even as an invitation, but as proof that there was always room. I walked back to the house. Margaret's lavender was blooming along the path, sharp and alive. And the kitchen light was on, warm, steady, the kind of light you can see from a long way off. The kind that says, "Come home. Thank you for staying." This story, it's not about revenge. It's about choosing your own guest list for life. If you've ever had to leave an empty chair for someone who chose not to show up, I see you. Drop a comment. Tell me about your chair. And if you want more stories about the families we choose, hit that subscribe button. Until next time.